Today's daf is daf Chaf Tes. We'll start 5 lines down from the bottom. Omer of Shalman. Ksiv. We have one pasuk, and this pasuk appears in Bamidbar. Ad Yerecha Ad Pircha Mikshahi. So we've been discussing for quite a while the concept of miksha, that the menorah has to be made, hammered out of one solid block. And the Gemara wants to know exactly what are the additional parts to the menorah and how many there are and so forth and so on. And that was the sugya that we learned yesterday. And then Amar Rav wants to address another issue, not with regard to the flowers and how many flowers there were and where the flowers were located, but rather what was the height of the menorah. And the Gemara understands Rav literally as Gova Shel Menorah Tisha Tfachim. We've already established that the height of the menorah is 18 Tfachim. And yet Rav seems to assume that the height of the menorah was only 9 Tfachim. That's half the amount that we had established. And not only that, it means that basically the menorah was quite low. And therefore, Esvei Rav Shimi bar Chia L'Rav, we have a Mishnah that says, Evan Hoysel Lefnei Menorah, Uba Sholosh Malos. They had a stone with 3 steps in order to climb up to the menorah. Shaleh Kohen Omed, Umetiv Haneros. And that's where you prepare the menorah. Now, if it's only 9 Tfachim high, then it's on the ground. There's no need to climb up steps. Amalei Shimi At. This is a phrase that appears very often in Shas. And according to most commentaries, this is not what we call a shtach. He wasn't putting him down. It was a Talmud of his. He was saying, I expected better of you. And how could you have asked me such a question? Ki kamina, you know that I never meant to say that the menorah was only 9 tefachim high. But what I meant to say, obviously, was misfas konim ulamala, meaning from the middle of the menorah and up, right? The menorah had let's say a staff at the bottom, and then it branched out on the top. And basically, the middle point of the menorah would rise another 9 tefachim, so it was all told 18 tefachim. Now the Gemara wants to know how Shlomo HaMelech, when he built the first Beis HaMikdash, how did he hammer out the gold for the menorah? And it's pretty fascinating. Ksiv, the Torah tells us in Malachim, V'haperach v'haneros v'hamilkachayim zohavu nichlos zohav. So there's going to be a lot of emphasis here on the phrase michlos zav. The literal translation of this pasuk is that there were 10 menorahs. Besides the menorah, there were another 10. 5 on one side and 5 on the other side. And this was the way that Shlomo Melech fulfilled his mitzvah of Zekel Yaveyu to beautify the menorah. And there were 10 menorahs made out of gold. And there were specifications about how to make those other 10 menorahs. As we said before, 5 on the right and 5 on the left. But what does it mean that the pasuk testifies that Shlomo Melech made all that he made for the sake of the Beis HaMikdash of Hashem, he made with michlos zav, literally closed gold. So the Gemara is going to ask this question immediately. My michlos zav, what does it mean closed or finished gold? Apparently, the Gemara understood that Shlomo had taken gold, pure gold, in its natural form, and he had processed it in order to remove any impurities, so that it would be finished gold or pure gold. Omar of Ami, Shekilato lechol zav sagur shel Shlomo. It seems that the process of refinement of the gold that was implemented by Shlomo was such that all other gold didn't match the gold of Shlomo. So, like, let's say, for example, the Shlomo HaMelech prepared the gold and purified it for the Mikdash, and that gold with its same, let's say, counterpart weight would be up for sale. No one would even consider buying that other counterpart because of the process and the tedious amount of refinement that Shlomo HaMelech put in to prepare all these kalim for the Beis HaMikdash that were made out of gold. And the gold was refined in such a way that he started with a large volume of gold, and after heating it up in the furnace to remove its impurities time after time after time, the gold somehow sunk, so to speak. It collapsed into a very hard piece of gold. The Omer of Yudah Marav, Eser Menoras Asa Shlomo, Kol Achas V'Achas Hevilo Elef Kikar Zov, V'chnisu Elef Pa'amim Lekor, V'midu Al Kikar. So we're talking about a massive amount of gold, the kikar of gold, which is a certain weight, multiplied by 1,000. That's the amount that Shlomo Melech had brought to the Beis HaMikdash, and he put them into a furnace, and he burned them 1, 2, 3, 1,000 times. So he's got 1,000 kikars, and he puts them through the furnace 1,000 times until he finally gets one kikar. So he started with 1,000, ends with one kikar. The Gemara says, Eini, is this really true? Vaksiv, the pasuk says, with regard to the building of the Mikdash. Now we're jumping into Divrei Yomim, where the Nach reviews the way that Shlomo Melech created the Mikdash, and it says, V'chol kli mashke hamelech Shlomo zav. Now we're talking about clay mashke. Clay mashke are drinking cups, drinking kalim, and all of these kalim were made by Shlomo with gold, out of gold. And the pasuk testifies that kol clay base ya'ar halvanon zav sagur, and it means that whatever Shlomo put into this Beis HaMikdash was closed gold, and nevertheless, ein kesef nechshav bimei Shlomo l'me'uma, meaning even that amount of gold would make silver absolutely worthless. In other words, nobody wanted to buy any silver because the gold of Shlomo Melech was so attractive on the market. But it means that Shlomo Melech still had a vast amount of gold, even after he prepared the Klei HaMikdash. Now, we said that just for the menorah alone, he gathered together and mined 1,000 kikram of zav. So how did he have so much excess gold that he could sell it on the market, and no one could compete with the gold on the market of Shlomo? So the Gemara says the following, that when it says that ein kesef nechshav l'me'uma, that during the time of Shlomo, silver was worthless. Today, by the way, silver is very high, but in those days, silver became worthless because of the expensive gold that Shlomo put on the market. That's not referring to closed gold, right? To the what we called in the pasuk michlos zav. Zav sagur kamina. When I said that Shlomo was so wealthy that he was able to gather together 1,000 kikars in order to produce one single kikar of zav, that was closed gold. That was the michlos zav. In truth, beyond that amount of gold, Shlomo Melech was so wealthy he had much more gold to sell on the market. Now the Gemara goes into a little bit of physics here about how could you put gold, 1,000 kikars, into a kiln, into a furnace, and reduce them to one single kikar. Umi chaser kuli hai? Does it really get reduced from 1,000 down to one, a ratio of 1,000 to one? and that's how much it's reduced by virtue of the refinement process in the furnace. For Tanya, we have a brisa that tells us a different kind of ratio. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Maisa v'hoisa menorah space hamikdash yisera al shel Shlomo. Now, we're talking about something that happened. It's called a Maisa. I don't know, some sort of incident that occurred. And we don't know exactly what occurred, but in any event, the menorah that was discovered as the menorah of the Beis Hamikdash had an excess, right? It says Yisera. Yisera means more than the menorah of Shlomo HaMelech. So they discovered that Moshe Rabbeinu's menorah, apparently they still held on to Moshe Rabbeinu's menorah, and the menorah of Moshe Rabbeinu, which was also made out of gold, was exceeded the menorah of Shlomo HaMelech by the weight of dinar zahav kurdikini. Okay, so this is a specific kind of dinar zahav that comes from Kurdistan, apparently. There's a whole discussion here about the Targum Uglis, who identifies Kurdistan as on the border between Turkey and Armenia, and that's where they had this this dinar, and this dinar was equal in size to the Isar, which is the subject of the Gemara at the beginning of Kiddushin, in terms of one shita in the Tanoim that he has to give his wife, his bride, to marry her an Isar Talki, which is a half, which is a certain ratio of a dinar. In any event, Hichnisu shmonim ponim lekur v'midu al kikar. All they had to do was put it into the furnace 80 times, not 1,000 times, like we said before, in order to produce that one kikar. So how can you tell me that the mass of gold that's lost goes from 1,000 to 1? Because then how is it possible that if the menorah was of Moshe Rabbeinu was only slightly heavier than a kikar, and you fired it up 80 times, that's all, and it becomes lighter, much lighter than a kikar. It's only the weight of a dinar zav kurdikini. So Gemara answers, Kevan de koi koi. Once you already have the weight that was created by this ultra refining process, then it's much easier at that point to fire it up and reduce it, and you don't even have to fire it up so many times. Okay, now we get on to the question about the menorah, whether or not the menorah is makabel tuma in comparison to the shulchan. Remember that the shulchan was used for the lechem apanim. Omer Rabbi Shmuel ben Omer Rabbi Yonasan. My dechsiv. What does the pasuk mean? He tells you here that this is a pasuk in Chaf Daled, in Vayikra Chaf Daled, al hamenorah hatahora. What is the significance of adding the word tahora as an adjective to describe the menorah? And Rabbi Shmuel says in the name of Rabbi Yonasan, she yardu ma'aseh b'makom tahara, that this word tahora is not a description of the halachic status of the menorah as far as Tumah V'Tara is concerned, whether it will be Makabel Tumah, it won't be Makabel. No. The subject of the word tahora and that description is what was the model that Moshe Rabbeinu followed in order to create the menorah. We said that the menorah is very complex. It has the branches and it has the flowers and all the different parts of the menorah, right? The gviyim and kafta v'ferach and so forth and so on. Moshe had to be shown a certain image that came down from Shemayim in order to see what the menorah looked like, so he could imitate that image. Sheyardu Masel Mimokum Tara Elameata. If this be the case, then whenever the Torah describes one of the Klei HaMikdash as tar, we should apply the same yardstick that Moshe Rabbeinu was shown to model. And in fact, the Torah says, Al HaShulchan HaTar. That means that the Lechem HaPonim would be stored, right? We said in 2 starim of 6 each, on a shulchan that's described by the Torah as tahar. And once again, you're gonna have to assume that tar means sheyardu masav mi makom tar. Now, nowhere do we find any hint, any indication that Moshe Rabbeinu had trouble creating the shulchan. The shulchan, relative to the menorah, was a cinch. There was no need for Moshe Rabbeinu to be seen some sort of heavenly model or picture, an image of what the shulchan looked like. Ella, therefore, we have to reinterpret the word tahar. What does it mean, ha-menorah ha-tahora, and what does it mean, ha-shulchan ha-tar? Tar michlal shu tameh. The Torah wants to teach us that the shulchan was tahar. It could have become tameh if he had come in contact with, let's say, a sheretz. And hachinami, we're going to apply the same interpretation of the word tahora with regard to the menorah, michlal sheitmei, that it can become tameh. Now, what's the chiddush here in telling me that the shulchan can contract tumah, and for that matter, the menorah could contract tumah? We have a halacha of mechuber lekarka. That which is connected to the ground is not makabel tumah, only metaltalin. Now, the word metaltalin etymologically means that it's movable, it's moved around. You can have metaltalin that theoretically are not attached to the ground, but they're so heavy that you can't move it from one place to the other without it breaking apart. And that has also a din of mechuber lekarka, and therefore it's not makabel tumah. Only metaltalin is makabel tumah. So bishlei mahasam, I understand why the pasuk had to teach me in the case of the shulchan that it could be makabel tumah. I would have had a havamina that the shulchan, because of its weight, would not be makabel tumah. The Yomi Reish Lakish, my dichsiv al shulchan atar michlal shu tameh, that become tameh. And the question is, how could this be so? Kli eitz ha'osi l'nachasu. Anything that's made lenachas, meaning it's stationary and it's put in its place. Right now, the Gemara assumes that the shulchan never moved. It was situated, located in the heichal, and they never moved it. And if they never moved it, then it could never be makabel tumah, because as we said before, even something that's theoretically movable, if it's never moved because it's attached, or I shouldn't say attached, but it's permanently placed on the ground in such a way that we don't move it, is not makabel tumah. So therefore, what was the point of the Torah adding the word tahar as if to be machadish that the shulchan never contracted tumah? The shulchan could never possibly contract tumah because it's asu l'nachas. Kol kliyetz asu l'nachas ena makabel tumah. Ella, so the Gemara says, Malamich Magbiano, so that the truth of the matter is that the shulchan was not absolutely stationary. It was actually moved. It was moved 3 times a year during the 3 regalim. She Magbiano soli oli regalim, marim lehem lechem aponim. Lechem aponim is in Parshas Emor, and there we have halacha ki siluko kach, kanachosu kach siluko, just as we put it down on the shulchan, these l'cham, the 12 l'cham, on the beginning of the week, and we took it down a week later on Shabbos. Nevertheless, it was still fresh and warm as if you had just put it there. This was the great miracle of the lechem aponim. The people who came on Aliyah for the mitzvah of Aliyah l'regel 3 times a year, they had to have a tremendous midah of bitachon, because they didn't have locks and security cameras the way we have today. So a person left his house up in Dan or down in Beersheba in order to come to the Beis Hamikdash 3 times a year, and he left his house behind. He also left his family behind. he had to have an absolute bitachon on Hashem that when he came back home, he would find his house exactly as he left it. So the people who came on Aliyah needed an extra chizuk for the midah bitachon. So Hashem said, you know what? God is watching you. God is protecting you. And I'm going to prove it to you from the great miracle of the lechem upon him. Look how you beloved you are in front of God. Nes gadol nase belechem upon him. Kisiluko kisiduro, the same way that they organized it a week earlier, it was still fresh a week later. Shenemar lasum lechem chom biyom hilokcha. So now the table had to be moved. It had to be lifted up in order to show and expose the bread. And how did they know it was still fresh and hot? Because the smell, the vapors came up. And that gave them a certain chizuk, as we said before. But because they took out the shulchan 3 times a year, therefore it was not considered nachas. It wasn't stationary, and it could be makabel tumah. And therefore the Torah adds an adjectival description of the shulchan as being a shulchan Torah. Elahacha tahora michlal shitmeya pshita. Why did the Torah have to tell me, in the case of the menorah, that it's tahora, meaning that it could become tameh? I understand why in the case of the shulchan, the Torah had to add the word tar to tell me that it could become tameh because it's not a kli nachas, because they took it out 3 times a year. But in the case of the menorah, kli matachos mekablim tumah. We're talking about a kli mateches, and a kli that's made out of metal, like for example, it's made out of gold, is makabel tumah under all circumstances. And this halacha, that if it's nachas and if it's stationary, then it's not makabel tumah, that doesn't apply to kli matechos, it only applies to kli eitz. And therefore, ela sheyardu ma'aseh mimakom tahara. So we're going to have now 2 different interpretations of the adjective that the Torah adds tar. One interpretation in the case of the shulchan to tell me that it is makabel tumah, but it's tar. And a second one in the case of the menorah, that the menorah was such a complex manufacturing headache that Moshe Rabbeinu had to be shown from the heavens an image of what the menorah had to look like. Tanya, we learned in the Brayso of Yosef Domer, Aron shall eish, v'shulchan shall eish, u'menorah shall eish, yardu min hashamayim. Wow. Look at that list. We have 3 great things that had to come down from Shemayim, meaning that Moshe had to be shown a tzura, an image of these 3 things. Okay, the last of the 3 is the menorah. Now that we said before, the menorah was very complex. Moshe didn't know how to put together all these different parts of the menorah. He had to be shown an image of the menorah. The Aron, it's hard to say that the Aron was so complicated, but it was complex in the sense that there was a layer of wood, and on top of that there was a layer of gold, and on top of the layer of gold there was a tzipui of eitz again. But then in the middle here we have the shulchan. So if that be the case, and we're going to prove from a pasuk that all these items, including the shulchan, had to be shown to Moshe Rabbeinu coming down from Shemayim as an image, then we could say that tar means tar min hashamayim in the case of the shulchan. Shenemar ure'eva aseh kitavni sam asher atah mar'eh bahar. The word tavni sam here is the crucial word. It means a tzura, an image, a form, was shown to Moshe Rabbeinu when he was at Har Sinai during those 40 days, 40 nights that he learned Torah at Har Sinai. And this pasuk, which appears in Shmos Perek Chof Hey, refers to all these 3 kelim, because Parshas Truma, which we'll read in Mirz Hashem in a few days, addresses or presents the building of the Aron and the Shulchan and the creation of the menorah. And then it says, Ra Moshe Vasa Kimosam meaning Kitavnisam Asher Atah. Elamiata now, according to this, when the Torah says, Vakimosias HaMishkan Kimishpato Asher Haresi Bahar Hachinami, now we're talking about the Mishkan itself, shall we assume that when the pasuk says, again, here it doesn't say exactly what we said before. There it said kiv tavni sam. Here it says kiv mishpato. But the Gemara right now doesn't differentiate between the two. And the Gemara says, is it possible that a fire from heavens descended with an image of the Mishkan, and Moshe had to see that image in order to build the Mishkan? We don't know that such a thing is true. And the Gemara answers no. Don't equate the two psukim. Hacha ksiv kimishpato, v'hasam ksiv kitavni sam. In the case of the Mishkan, mishpato, meaning all the laws and requirements of building the Mishkan, had to be revealed to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai. But in the cases of the other three Klei HaMikdash, right, we spoke about the Aron and the Shulchan and the Menorah, there Moshe Rabbeinu had to be seen ki tavni sam. He had to see the image. Who is the one amongst the great celestial angels who had the job to show Moshe Rabbeinu these kelim? And the fact that they were in Aish, they were coming down in fire, that indicates that we're talking about Gavriel. Gavriel is the malach of fire. He controls fire. In fact, Chazal say that when Avram Avinu was thrown into the furnace, it was Gavriel who came down to cool off the fire. So Gavriel is the controller of fire in both directions. He generates fire and he controls the fire. Anyway, Gavriel was Chagur Kimin Pisikya Hoya. It's a strange kind of thing. He showed up in a human form wearing an apron, a worker's apron. Ve'heralo Moshe Maseh HaMenorah. He was like a carpenter. He showed Moshe Rabbeinu how to construct the menorah. Tichsiv v'zeh Maseh. Now we're having a pasuk in Truma again that says HaMenorah. Okay, so Tana de Rabbi Shmuel Shol Shedvarim Hayu Kashalom. There are three things that Moshe Rabbeinu had trouble understanding. God had to point with his finger to show Moshe some sort of an image. Eluhem, number one, menorah. The menorah was very complicated. Number two, now in all these three cases, it's going to say the word zeh, and zeh means God pointed with a finger. Then we have Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh means the molad. The molad is hardly visible, and it has to be a certain size in order to declare Rosh Chodesh. So Moshe Rabbeinu had to see an image of the molad in order to implement the laws of Rosh Chodesh. And number three, Shrotzim. Now, for Shrotzim, I'd like to mention a long footnote here, which we don't have time to go through the whole footnote, but the halacha is that there are many, many, many shrotzim in nature, but the Torah only prohibits 8 shrotzim that are defined in Vayikra Yud Aleph as tmeim, as shrotzim tmeim. So not every sheretz, we see a lot of shrotzim, right? The crawling things, the creeping things, but not all of them are tamei. On the fact, very few of them are tamei, only 8. The 8 are Chinese to us. What do I mean Chinese? The Torah says HaCholed, HaAkbar, HaTzav, and then it says Haltov, HaChomet, HaTinshomet, HaNokov, HaKoch, all these. So there are 8 of them. And again, I'm not going to go through the list here. What are these 8 shrotzim? Because even today, we're not exactly sure if we have the right, definition of the shrotzim. In any event, God showed Moshe Rabbeinu these 8 shrotzim, so he would know which of the shrotzim are tmeim, because Moshe couldn't recognize that as on. Okay, menorah dichsiv. Let's go through it. Where does it say zeh? So first of all, in the case of menorah, it says zeh masa menorah. Zeh meaning Hashem had to show him with a finger exactly what the menorah would look like. Rosh Chodesh, he pointed to the molad. Tichsiv hachodesh hazeh lachem. Rosh Chodesh emphasized the word hazeh. And shrotzim tichsiv v'zeh lachem hatamei. So the word zeh means these I'm showing you are the Shvatzim Tmeim. Yesh Omrim, there was another one. Four things. Hilchos, Shchita, the laws of Shchita. Shenemar v'zeh asher taseh al hamizbeach. Now, the word v'zeh always teaches us that Hashem had to show him with a finger. And now we're talking about kodshim, and the same definition of shchita in kodshim applies to regular shchitas chulin as well. And what are the precise boundaries on the neck of the animal that if he goes beyond those boundaries, the shchita is not valid? Now, I'm not sure exactly if the Gemara means that every single animal was brought to Moshe Rabbeinu's attention as to how to do the shechita. That I don't know. Okay, now we talk about the Mishnah. The Mishnah, if you recall, as we learned yesterday, gives us a whole list of mitzvos that have numbers, and the numbers are likuva. Like, for example, shtei parshios in mezuzah V'hayim Shmoa, and V'haya and V'hayim Shmoa, you have After in the V'hayim Shmoa shtei parshios, and makva zuzu. If you make a mezuzah with only one of these two parshios, it's not worth the parchment it's made on. If it's made on parchment, which I doubt. Anyway, v'afilu ksav echad ma'akfan. Not only that, even if one letter is missing, we saw in the Mishnah yesterday that the mezuzah is psula. Now, what does that mean? He omitted a letter. We'll see the Gemara later on that it means it wasn't mukaf kavil, which we'll explain. Pshita. Why did the Mishnah feel compelled to have to teach me that if you're missing a letter, the mezuzah is psula? That seems so obvious. Whoa, this is the famous Kotzo Shel Yud. Now, the Kotzo Shel Yud really has three different. Let's see, let me see how do you translate. Kotz is a point. Okay, so there are three different points in the Yud. So if you can follow with my fingers, which I should really pick up the diagram and show it to you, but I don't know how well you'll see it on Zoom, but the Yud has a point on the top left, then it goes down towards the right, and there's a point on the bottom right, and then the body of the Yud also moves towards the left, and on the bottom of that, there's another point. And we have a three-way machlokus in Rishonim. Which of the 3 points is the Kotzo Shel Yud that the Gemara has in mind, that without the Kotzo Shel Yud, the Yud is psula, and that passes the entire mezuzah. And Rashi has it that the Kotzo Shel Yud, believe it or not, is on the bottom right. Rabbeinu Tam, his grandson, has the Kotzel Shel Yud on the bottom left. Both of these, frankly, are a little bit disappointing for me because I always thought the Kotzel Shel Yud is on top, which is indeed the Rosh's shita. So I'm here with the Rosh. Anyway, we go on. V'hanami pshita. I mean, if the Kotzel Shel Yud is missing, then the Gemara thinks it's apparent, and you don't have to tell me any chidushim here that the Yud is possible. It's not properly written, and therefore it's possible. And why did the Mishnah have to teach me? Ella, the Gemara offers another interpretation. Le'idach de Rabbi Yehuda Marav. The Amar Rabbi Yehuda Marav. I just want to make sure I didn't skip anything. Okay, tell me if I skip anything. Ella, the Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Kol o sheina mukaf kavil. Me arbaruch oseha. So in other words, it has to be empty parchment surrounding the letter. No 2 letters could be connected. So if you have a letter that's connected, it's not mukaf kavil, and therefore it's possible. Now, I'm not even sure you could fix it. You really have to know the laws of Stam. Maybe we'll learn about this, Sefer Torah, Mezuzah, and Tefillin, in order to figure out whether or not things can be fixed if they were made mistakenly. I mean, those who are Sofrim will study this for months. So many complicated possibilities. Like even the Yud itself, the Kotz Yud, we have 3 possibilities. Omar Ashiyah, and I don't know where that name comes from, Bar Nidbach, maybe it was a ger, I don't know, Mishmei de Rabbi Yehuda, Nikav Tocho Shel Hayud, I'm sorry, Nikav Tocho Shel Hey, So nikev means there's like a puncture in the cloth, in the parchment itself, and it's in the middle of the hay. Kosher. We're not exactly sure why. Yerecho, but if there's a puncture in the leg of the hay, now keep in mind that the hay has two legs, one on the right and one on the left. Possible. I have an interpretation of what he has in mind. Nikev tocho shel hay kosher. It means that if there's an empty space in the middle of the hay, which there has to be, and it was punctured, so you have like a hole in the middle of the hay, it's kosher. Why? Because it doesn't detract from the general tsura, and you still see it as a hay. Again, a hay with a hole in the middle, but nevertheless a hay. But Yerecho, what would be the deal if there's a hole in the leg of the hay? It all depends if Nishtayer bo kashir os ktana, if it still has the length, the size of a yud, kosher vim lav, but if it becomes smaller than a yud, possible. Okay.